July 4th, 1976, 3 a.m., Entebbe Airport, Uganda. A massive figure paces in his presidential office, Idi Amin, the self-proclaimed conqueror of the British Empire. Just hours ago, he personally assured Palestinian hijackers that his elite guards made this airport an impenetrable fortress. Now, in the darkness, Israeli commandos are silently landing on his runway. In just 90 minutes, they'll rescue every hostage and shatter his image of invincibility forever. You might think being one of Africa's most powerful dictators meant having everything. But for Idi Amin, it meant watching your own strength become your greatest weakness. This is the story of a man who gained an empire, only to become a prisoner of his own power. Before we dive into this incredible story, let me paint you a picture of who Idi Amin was. Standing 6 feet 4 inches and built like a heavyweight boxer, Amin rose from a poverty-stricken childhood to become Uganda's most feared leader. In 1971, as a military commander, he seized power in a coup, promising to make Uganda great. But what happened next is a masterclass in how power can destroy the very person wielding it. We're going to explore 3 ways Amin's own power became his prison, his military image became his downfall, and how every solution he created only made his problems worse. It's a story that will make you question everything you think you know about power. But before we continue, if you're fascinated by how power changes people, hit subscribe. We're creating a whole series about leaders who became prisoners of their own success, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Let's start with something most people don't know about Amin's first day as Uganda's leader. On January 25th, 1971, after successfully seizing power, Amin walked into the treasury expecting to find the wealth of a nation. Instead, he found next to nothing. The previous government had nearly emptied the coffers. Imagine that moment. You've just become one of the most powerful men in Africa, but you can't even pay your own military. This was Amin's first taste of how power could become a prison. But it gets worse. Remember that military that helped him seize power? It was actually deeply divided along tribal lines. Some units were loyal to the previous government, others to various tribal leaders, and only a small faction truly loyal to Amin himself. So what did he do? The same thing that would become his pattern. He tried to solve it with force. He began eliminating anyone he suspected of disloyalty. But here's the tragic irony. Every person he eliminated created new enemies among their friends and family. Every move to secure his power only made him more vulnerable. By 1975, this paranoia reached its peak with the murder of Archbishop Janani Luwum. Now, killing political opponents was one thing, but killing a religious leader? That crossed a line that changed everything. Suddenly, opposition to Amin wasn't just political, it was moral. He'd created enemies he couldn't intimidate or eliminate. Dr. Sarah Kasozi, a Ugandan historian, puts it this way: Amin's tragedy was that he saw enemies everywhere, so he made enemies everywhere. His presidential palace became his prison, with every window a potential sniper's nest, every shadow a potential assassin. Let me give you a specific example of how bad this got. By 1977, Amin was sleeping in a different room every night, even within his own palace. He had food tasters for every meal, and he became so paranoid that he would sometimes force his cabinet ministers to publicly eat food prepared for him, just to prove it wasn't poisoned. His own personal doctor later revealed that Amin would often go days without proper sleep, convinced that assassins would strike the moment he let his guard down. The ultimate irony? These extreme security measures made him more vulnerable. His erratic sleeping patterns affected his judgment. His constant rotation of staff meant no one gained enough experience to serve effectively. His fear of poison meant he was often malnourished, affecting his physical and mental health. Think about that for a moment. If you're watching this, take a second to drop a comment below about whether you think absolute power is worth it, if it means never feeling safe again. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Now, let's talk about how Amin's carefully built image became his greatest weakness. Remember that Entebbe raid we opened with? That wasn't just a military defeat. It was the moment Amin's whole identity crumbled. See, Amin had spent years building his image as this unbeatable military genius. He gave himself ridiculous titles like Conqueror of the British Empire and Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the sea. He wore military uniforms covered in medals he awarded himself. But here's the thing about creating a larger-than-life image. It has to match reality. And reality came knocking at 3 a.m. on that July morning in 1976. Israeli commandos didn't just rescue the hostages, they humiliated Amin's entire security apparatus. They landed without detection, drove to the airport in black Mercedes cars similar to Amin's own, and completed their mission while Amin's elite guards were caught completely off guard. The world was watching, and suddenly everyone could see. The emperor had no clothes. International media had a field day. Political cartoons showed Amin cowering under his bed, while Israeli commandos walked right past his elite guards. But the real betrayal was yet to come. In March 1978, members of his own military, the very institution he'd built his image around, tried to assassinate him. Think about that. The man who claimed to be Uganda's greatest military leader couldn't even trust his own soldiers. If you're finding this story as fascinating as I do, hit that like button. It helps more people discover these incredible historical tales. But the most tragic part of Amin's story is how every solution he created only made things worse. Let's talk about his biggest self-inflicted wound, the Asian expulsion of 1972. Uganda had a large population of Asian residents, mostly of Indian descent, who controlled much of the economy. Amin saw them as an easy target to boost his popularity. So, he ordered them all to leave, giving them 90 days to exit the country. On paper, it probably seemed brilliant to him. Take their businesses, give them to Ugandans, instant economic revolution, right? Wrong. What actually happened was an economic apocalypse. These Asian Ugandans weren't just business owners. They were doctors, teachers, engineers, and administrators. When they left, entire systems collapsed. Hospitals couldn't function. Supply chains broke down. The economy went into free fall. But instead of admitting his mistake, Amin doubled down. He printed more money, causing hyperinflation. He seized more businesses, causing more chaos. Every solution created two new problems. It all came to a head in 1978 when he decided to invade Tanzania. Why? Because he thought a war would unite the country behind him and distract from the economic disaster. Instead, Tanzania counterattacked and with the help of Ugandan exiles, drove Amin from power. The final irony? The man who had expelled others from Uganda was now forced to flee himself. He ended up in Saudi Arabia, where he lived in relative obscurity until his death in 2003. Former visitors described finding him in a small shop, the once mighty dictator reduced to haggling over prices with customers who had no idea who he was. In his final years, he was often seen sitting alone in a coffee shop, staring into space for hours, perhaps remembering when he had been one of the most powerful men in Africa. His own son later revealed that Amin would sometimes wake up screaming in the night, still haunted by the ghosts of his past. The empire of power he had built had become nothing but a prison of memories. If you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who appreciates deep dives into history's most fascinating stories. Subscribe and hit that notification bell, because next week we're exploring another leader who learned the hard way that power isn't all it's cracked up to be. Remember, as Amin's story shows us, sometimes the thing we think will make us strongest becomes the very thing that destroys us.